And recording's on. Thank you, everybody. This is Rob Packard from Medical Device Academy. Today I'm hosting a webinar with Annex III. David Levesque is our guest speaker, and he's going to be advancing the slides, but I am recording the session. So I would request that you not share your video because your video will show up on our screen here. But you can see my video and you can see David's. That was David waving, and this is me waving. But David's going to be advancing the slides. We're going to have Q&A at the end. If this something that you want to say verbally, you can certainly unmute yourself and then ask the question. But you can also use the chat box if you're hooked into the computer. And then, of course, there's our contact information, both David's and mine, in the slide deck. So you can contact us directly and ask proprietary questions, because this will be a recorded session, and I would prefer not to have to go back and edit out all the top secret information you've shared with everybody. So after giving that introduction, I'll hand off to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for being here. As Rob mentioned, I'm David Levesque. I'm the VP of Sales for Annex III, and I'm located in the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area, and it's really early in the morning, so if you hear the birds chirping away with us, that's why. Go ahead, Rob. Do you want to go over the agenda?
I completely spaced on that. Sorry about that. We had said that I was going to do the first few slides, and I forgot.
Yeah.
I even
Okay.
put my initials at the bottom of the screen to help me.
Okay.
So today, the agenda, we're going to start out with a brief intro. We're going to talk a little bit about what post-market clinical follow-up is and what it's not, because there's a lot of people that capture a piece of it and think that's all of it. And so I'm going to go through that a little bit. We're going to explain why post-market clinical follow-up and post-market surveillance is getting a lot more attention now. And we're going to talk a little bit how to do it. And that's approximately where we're going to shift over to David doing the bulk of the presentation. But there will be Q&A at the end, so you can ask either of us questions. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. What PMCF is not. So post-market, actually, that's a typo there. It should be PMCF, not PMFC. So we both missed that one. But it's supposed to be post-market clinical follow-up is not. So all of these things could be in a post-market clinical follow-up study or a plan, but any one of these things is not post-market clinical follow-up. So some people think, well, I do customer satisfaction surveys as part of post-market surveillance. And yes, that's part of post-market surveillance, but that's not all of post-market surveillance, and it's definitely not post-market clinical follow-up, because it's not gathering clinical data, it's gathering satisfaction data. Customer surveys could ask clinical questions and could ask clinical outcomes and could address residual risks, but a survey is generally not the same as a case report form and is not always geared towards your residual risks and answering those questions. So that's also generally not sufficient as a post-market clinical follow-up study by itself, or even adequate as your only plan. A clinical study generally is referred to as clinical studies are always human studies, and they're almost always prior to launching a product in the field as an approved product, or in the FDA's case, cleared products. But you can also do post-market clinical studies. So there's still clinical studies, they're still involving human subjects, but it's after you have approval to gather this post-market data. And just collecting the data from a study is not your entire post-market clinical follow-up plan. It's just a piece of it. Literature searches looking for clinical data on your product and clinical data on other products that are equivalent to yours, or even other products that are used to treat the same disease or diagnose the same disease, but may not be equivalent to your product. Those are also part of your post-market clinical follow-up plan, and post-market surveillance plan, they should even be part of your clinical evaluation, but they're not by in and of itself a post-market clinical follow-up plan. Or yeah, the next one is post-market surveillance. So post-market surveillance is much broader than just post-market clinical follow-up. And it's definitely not a one-time activity. It's supposed to be something you continuously do. You may change the protocol over time. You may change your plan over time. You may add things you ask. You may eliminate things that you were asking before because you've gotten enough data and don't need any more data. You may have eliminated a risk, so it's no longer a concern. You may have discovered a new risk that you need to add to your surveys and your questions and your case report forms and your protocols. But it's definitely not a one-time activity. So management needs to get used to the concept of this is something they're going to have to do continuously over the life of the product. And the plan definitely must change, because every single time you gather complaint data, adverse event data, look at literature searches, anytime you're gathering post-market data of any kind, you should be going back to your risk analysis and saying, do we need to update something? And one of those things you might update is your post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up plans to address new risks that you've identified or risks that appear to have changed. And that could be due to new accessories that they're being used with, changes in how they treat patients and policies and procedures. It could even be changes in technology and what's considered best in class standard of care. So all those things can change your plans. And your post-market surveillance plan and your post-market clinical follow-up plan are not a procedure. A procedure would be something you would apply to the whole company and all your products, whereas you need a separate post-market surveillance plan and post-market clinical follow-up plan and post-market clinical follow-up protocol for every product or product family. So I think I covered all the what it's not. Next slide. Okay, why it matters. And I'm not going to go super in depth on this. I'm going to cover the highlights. But in the MDR regulations, and specifically we're talking regulation 2017-745 that comes into effect in May of this year, Annex III is where you're required to have technical documentation on post-market surveillance. This is a new technical documentation requirement that really wasn't anywhere near as in-depth or comprehensive in the MDD or the AIMD. They were asking for you to provide evidence of post-market surveillance activities and a procedure, typically at a notified body for CE marking in the past. Now they have an entire annex telling you what they want, and it's much more comprehensive. And I don't think you're going to find hardly any notified bodies saying, here's your CE marking, if you don't have a post-market clinical follow-up plan. And that plan could be a full-blown protocol and study, or it could be a mixture of many, many things, and probably should be. But writing justifications for why you're not going to do post-market clinical follow-up is probably not going to be accepted by most notified bodies. In theory, you could put in a justification for why you're not going to do it, but I haven't seen that work for any clients under the new MDR. Clinical data is covered in Annex 4, Part A, and clinical data would include both data collected prior to launch of your product and after the launch of your product. So post-market clinical data is also clinical data, as is literature searches that have clinical data. So it's all clinical data, it's just a matter of when you collect it, and they have a whole entire annex, Part A, that's going to be about clinical data, and then the Part B is about post-market clinical follow-up. So if you really want to know what is the specific requirements for PMCF in the MDR, it's in Annex 14, Part B. And here's a couple of reasons why they created this whole new technical documentation on PMS section. These are just two examples. There are others, but one of them is, we probably shouldn't single out Zimmer. It's the metal-on-metal hip implants that were out there. I'm familiar specifically with the Zimmer clinical study data and the results after the product was launched. So I'll use those specifically. The approximate revision rate for metal-on-metal hip implants was about 0.5% when the product's clinical study was done. This was a pre-market clinical study done in the US. I believe it was in the US, but it might have been global. And they had 0.5% for a select few surgeons that were involved as investigators in the study. When they launched the product commercially, I believe the error rate or revision rate jumped up to 14%. And with that high of an increase, you'd wonder, well, why did this happen? It would be a good product that would be safe at 1% or less, but a product that's 14% revision rate, you don't want 14% of your patients needing a new hip implant shortly after it was put in their body. And the reason for that is really twofold. Number one, you've expanded the number of surgeons from a select few surgeons that were experts and knew this product very well and were involved in the development to now it's given to all orthopedic surgeons that do hip implants. And so not all of them are the same level of experience and know the product as well. So when you go to a broader group, you have more use errors and you have different skill levels and experience. And then the second part of this is patient selection. When you expand it to a very large market, some people are not good candidates for the surgery, and those people would have been excluded in a clinical study that's pre-market. You would only pick the patients that are good candidates for the surgery and exclude the others from the study. But that doesn't mean doctors won't say, we'll try it anyway on this patient because we don't have a lot of other good options, or the patient really wants this device, and they may not be good choices for that patient. And you shouldn't have a swing from 0.5% to 14%, but we did. And so that really illustrates that although the metal-on-metal hip implants could be useful, they can only be useful for select surgeons and select patients. And that's not really something you want to be approving, and that's why those products have been recalled. The other reason for this post-market surveillance focus is fraud and adverse events associated with breast implants in the PIP scandal. PIP was a French company that was making breast implants, and the company used industrial grade silicone instead of medical grade silicone, and they had a lot of adverse events and even deaths for those breast implants, and it was hundreds of thousands of women that had this problem. And if we had tighter post-market surveillance controls for both of these products, we would have had a lot fewer adverse events, a lot fewer patients that were harmed. So there's an emphasis now, not only in Europe, but globally, to try to reduce these kinds of widespread problems by focusing more on post-market surveillance. The Europeans have added a bunch of other things in there as well, but the single biggest control that they can implement is tighter post-market surveillance to catch these problems, because you can't catch everything prior to approval of the product. Next slide. And now it's you.
So today we wanted to talk to you about the deliverables for your post-market clinical follow-up program. And they are data, which is collected by Annex 7 if you choose to work with us. And then, of course, the analysis of the data, which you can either do in-house or partner with another company on. And then Rob and his company will provide the PMCF report. And then they will also provide for you the update of the clinical evaluation report and the risk management file, and then do the IFU. And I'm sorry, Rob, what's PSCUR? Rob?
Helps if I unmute myself, sorry.
Okay.
A PSUR is a periodic safety update report. It's a new requirement in the MDR. It's required annually for products that are higher risk, and I believe it's every 2 years for lower risk products. And it will be required to actually be uploaded to the UniMed database along with updated labeling. And that PSUR will be available to customers so they can see, or potential patients and users, so they can see what are the adverse event rates that are expected with this product. It's very much like a drug insert where they'll tell you, here are the frequency of side effects that we saw in the clinical study. Same thing here. They're requiring you to create a standardized update report telling you what is the frequency and what are the severity of adverse events and complications and side effects for your product. And they require you to update that either annually or biannually, depending on the risk of your product and also the safety of the product. So if your device is not as safe as they would hope, they might require you to do more frequent updates or actually make a special update based on new information.
Rob, did you want to expand on any of these other reports?
Um, I can expand a little bit. That's a good idea. The PMCF report, I think the key there is you would have a protocol that you would follow and update the report. And it's not a one-time thing. It's whenever you have new data and you decide how frequently you analyze that data. So just like in a clinical study, you might have interim time points where you gather the data and analyze it. And the trend in clinical studies is to have um, flexibility in the study so you can increase the number of subjects or decrease the number of subjects based on how the preliminary data is coming in. So that is something you can do as well in a post-market study. The clinical evaluation reports are something anybody that's doing CE Mark should be familiar with. That's a summary of both the literature review and any clinical studies or post-market clinical studies that you've done, justifying why the device is safe and efficacious and continues to be state of the art. The risk management file is something that gets updated as a result of new post-market data that you receive and clinical evaluation data you receive. So any clinical data or any post-market data you receive, you need to review your risk management file and update that. And it's not just one document. That's a risk management report. This is the whole risk management file is supposed to be updated and continuously updated. So post-market surveillance, clinical evaluations, and risk management are all updated, and one feeds into the other. And if you have any changes to risk, then you're supposed to update your IFU. So if you don't have changes to risk, no need to update IFU as in number 6, but that is something that they expect you to do if there are any changes in risk. And so I think I've covered all the other items there, except maybe the analysis of data. We did have a question about that, and I got a response from our clinical expert, but it's somebody that is qualified to do the analysis. And generally, somebody that would be qualified to analyze clinical data would be somebody that's a biostatistician. It's possible that you might have somebody other than a biostatistician that can do the analysis if it's simple, but in general, when you have primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, you want to make sure that you know how the analysis is done. And it is possible you could have had a biostatistician say what the statistical analysis will be in the protocol, and then you could follow that if you're skilled enough. But if you don't know what it means when the biostatistician gives you a plan for doing this statistical analysis, you definitely shouldn't be the one doing the analysis. That's it for this slide.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob. So the steps in doing your PMCF study include defining your timeline, the data to be collected, which Rob was just talking about around the analysis of the data, and then the study parameters, such as the duration and the number of patients that you'll be collecting data from. Of course, once we've defined all the planning and the protocol, the next step is to actually collect the data, analyze the data as we've talked about, and then Rob mentioned continuously updating your documents, and of course, training your sales teams now that you have all this great data about your product, and then of course, winning more and more market share in the market. So this is a picture of all the different data types that you can collect using the Animan 7 platform for your study. Some may be required for your reports. Some you may just want to collect for other reasons. So Animan 7 is a platform that is an app that faces the patient that's configurable to whatever data you want to collect. And it also is connected via APIs to a lot of clinical data that already exists. So if we just start on the left side, you see the primary care doctors, and then going up and around clockwise, you have the lab data, EMR data, wearables data, such as a watch or a Fitbit or a scale. and questionnaires or patient-reported data, and then genetic data. And then the platform can collect all that data from the patient, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then it can send the data to, of course, yourself, the sponsor, or the CRO that you're working with in an anonymized way. And if you like, for care coordination, also send the data to the physician in a non-anonymized way. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that for you now. I'm going to switch my screen over to my phone screen, and I will show you the app. So when the patient has the app on their phone, they are able to have their full health record from those locations that I just mentioned to you. So they can click on allergies and see all their allergies. They can click on body measurements and see all their body measurements. Now, this data can be entered by the patient, or it can be imported from the patient's hospital, as I mentioned a moment ago. So you see here on the screen that the patient, under the services tab, they understand that they're in a clinical trial that you're running at the top. And then down below, you can see where it says import my data from my hospital or my lab. And I'll just go back to the screens where we're collecting data from the patient. So this is the part that's configurable to your study. You can see here on this screen, there are two icons at the bottom. One is for our post-market study that we're doing with EORTC right now. And this is the simple validated instrument that EORTC has created, and the quality of life questions are here. These questions can be, of course, any questions that you choose or need to collect from the patient for your post-market study. And then we have another screen here for more complicated studies that go over many weeks or months, where the patient knows and is alerted each time it's time to enter data. And these data points are even more specific, such as a sleep scale or glasses of water. And what's unique about the Annex 7 platform is that it can collect all types of data. So as I showed in the diagram earlier, it has all the clinical data. It can also have the patient take a picture of their skin, and they would submit the data to you for your study. And I'm happy to show more about the app in the question Q&A section. Right now, I'm going to go back to the slides. Maybe before I go back to the slides, let me just make one comment here. I know there was questions about how do you motivate the patients to fill out the data. We have email notifications, in-app notifications, and fundamentally, we believe that because the Annex 7 is both a full health record for the patient with access to all their data and something they're using in the research, that they will keep it over the long term. And so that makes it much more engaging for them, because they're just fundamentally, their health record is there and it's valuable to them. And one more point I didn't mention is that, of course, you can, as the sponsor, ask for any data that you want, and it can come from the EMR, and the patient can choose to share that with you. Now, I'll just show you how the sharing looks, because I think that's really important, especially for folks that are subject to GDPR. As you may know, that requires that the patient can control their data and see who has access to their data. So in our sharing screen here in Annex 7, you can see that the patient knows that they've shared their data with the second person on the list here. And it's very clear to them that they've consented to that sharing of data. So I'll go ahead and go back to the slides now. So again, this is, go ahead, Rob.
One thing I would like to point out for people that aren't familiar with what a pro system is, these are patient-reported outcomes. The patient shares the data. So they import the data from all these different sources that are shown on this screen, but the patient owns the data. The patient has the app, and they decide who they share it with. It's not, my own experience working with hospitals and doctors is you have to go out of your way to request files and request CDs and digital files of imaging and any lab results. And it's hard to get sometimes, and definitely hard to share if you want a second opinion. So this not only gives you gives the sponsors who might be doing a study access to it if they're given permission. But more importantly, it's all patient centered. So the patient has access to their own data and they can get a second opinion or look back and like, well, what was it last year? Have I gotten healthier or gotten worse?
Thank you, Rob. And this can also be helpful as you're building registries for your products, where you can have the patients download the app and be in your registry and share any data that's continuously synchronized from the EMR or the lab or anything like that as well. So there's 3 easy steps for setting up a PMCF study with Annex 7. Well, first, of course, we identify which data it is you like to collect, and then we do the integration to share the data with you. And then the enrollment is really simple. The PI will enter the email of the patient into a web portal that we provide. And then as you can see, you see that on the left screen, and in the middle screen, you see that the patient is notified that there's an app to download and install. And when there's new questionnaires available, you see the alert there that it's time to enter some data. And then on the right is an example of the screenshots, which we looked at just a moment ago in the app, where the patient's entering the data. And Annex 7 is a global platform. It is already in 22 languages today for all the standard fields. Of course, we can always add more fields, and a lot of times the questions are specifically, they're not standardized necessarily, so we would translate those as needed by your study. Annex 7 is currently working with Janssen, the European Commission, EORTC, as we mentioned, and also mostly all of the EMRs in the United States. So we are a company that's about 5 years old. We have many projects going on and a good amount of experience in doing post-market studies or clinical regulated studies. So there were several questions about pricing, so happy to talk about that. So the pricing for your study depends on the number of endpoints or the number of data points that you're collecting, and then how many places you would like us to send the data. Is it to just your EDC or also to the physician? And then how many months is your study? The language translations, which we just talked about, the number of patients. So a typical study can be anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000, depending on these variables.
Just to comment on the previous slide, I have many clients that ask me how much will it cost and how long will it take? These are the number 1 and number 2 questions that every CEO asks. How much money will it cost? How long will it take? And the answer by most experts is it depends. And of course, there are variables here, but David was kind enough to give you a range that's not out of, it's a ballpark range of what you might expect for doing this type of study. By comparison, if you were to do a pre-market clinical study, you could probably add a 0. So when people ask me for what will it cost to do my study, I have seen clinical studies that are pre-market that were hundreds of thousands of dollars, but more typically I see things that are millions of dollars, $1, $2, $3 million. So there's a very big difference in the cost of doing these studies, and this method of data collection also saves a lot of money. So that is a major driver for why a company would want to sponsor this, is to save a 0, which is nothing to laugh at. Next slide.
Thank you, Rob.
For compliance with all the things that are required for CE marking and technical files and design history files for a company, there are many things. These are just ballpark numbers. I didn't even give you a range because they're truly just ballparks. The only one that I can say that is probably a fairly firm number would be that clinical evaluation report. We get the question all the time, how much will it cost for a clinical evaluation report? So we threw out a number of $15,000. There are some that will take us much longer than others, and therefore we're going to make less per hour. And there are others that go fairly smoothly and will make the hourly rate we expect. But since we're the experts and not the client, we don't think it's fair in general to have the client sign up for one number and then sort of a bait and switch and get a different number much later just because it was tough for us. We should have been experts and analyzed it and said, this is how long it's going to take us. So in general, that's what we're quoting people for clinical evaluation reports. But if you had something special, it might be more or might be less, and we would give you a formal quote. These other items, a risk management file, we're creating some first-time risk management files for clients. Some FDA submissions require it, but all the FDA, anything that's FDA regulated will need a risk management file, even if it's not required for the submission. CE marking, they actually review the risk management file when you submit it. The post-market surveillance plan is required for CE marking. It's not something you typically have for FDA submissions, but it is for CE marking. Literature searches are something you would do before you do clinical evaluation, before you do a post-market clinical follow-up protocol, or before you do a clinical study. So that literature search is to identify risks that exist for the product and competitor products that are similar to it. And you might even do that as an input into your design to identify potential hazards for devices like the one you're working on. The post-market clinical follow-up protocol and a case report form, those would be prepared just like you would for a preclinical study. This would be for a post-market study, and we have a clinical expert that helps us with that. I don't know if she's on the call today. I haven't seen all the people that logged in, but her name is Jo Wells. And she's actually working on a protocol right now that we're going to be sharing with David's team and getting a quote for our client on doing a post-market clinical follow-up study using Annex III. There's a post-market surveillance report that companies require. The post-market surveillance procedure and report and the post-market clinical follow-up plans, we're actually making some major revisions to that right now in our system. Let me take a drink of water here. There was recently a brand new ISO standard that was released. I have a link to that on one of the later slides, and it actually has a whole section in the annex, I think it's Annex C, for plans, how to create a post-market surveillance plan. So that's definitely something that you might be interested in purchasing. It's certainly a lot cheaper than my consulting time, and it is an ISO standard, so it would be recognized internationally. I don't know if there's a European version yet. I don't think there is because it's very brand new. I think it was released very, very recently. But I actually have I did a pre-order. So AAMI offers a pre-order before the final one is released. So it may not even be available in any other format right now. But I found it to be excellent quality and very helpful for these types of activities. We already talked a little bit earlier about IFU updates, but if you don't have any changes to your risk management and your product's on the market and you're not having complaints or use errors, then you don't need to update your IFU and you'd make no changes unless it was a marketing change, like we changed our logo or something. But if you have a change, as adverse events, problems that exist with your product, then you need to update your IFUs, and that's one of the things that are as an output of your risk management process is updating IFUs with new residual risk or modified ones. And then we had talked earlier about PSURs, the periodic safety update reports that are required by Europe. That's a new requirement, and both the IFU updates and the PSUR updates need to be uploaded to UNIMED, which will go live in 2022. The PSUR, we don't even have templates finalized for that. We don't have guidance yet from the EU on it. I know what's going to be included in it, and I know how much work is involved, so I'm estimating that's $2,000. It's basically a day's worth of work. But until we have final guidance on it and we can actually upload one, it's a guess. But the way we work is we give clients solid numbers, and that way they don't have any surprises later on in the billing. And if it takes us more or less time, that's our issue, not the client's. Next slide. Ooh, my favorite slide. How long does it take? So this is the other question all the CEOs ask, like, when will this be over? And I think it's important to look at the far right of the screen there, and where it says the word repeat. These are continuous activities. Yes, you could potentially gather enough data over time and have enough history with your product that you don't need to collect any more data. but that's measured in decades for a lot of products. And so for companies that are just doing CE marking for the first time and doing their first post-market clinical follow-up study, don't expect that this is going to be done in 6 to 12 months. Just to go through one cycle could take you 24 months. But it all depends on what the device is. It's going to be very different for an implant that's going to be in the body for a decade than it is for an IVD test that's going to be used in minutes. So the data collection period depends on how many users there are, how many, um, how long the device is used, and what kind of clinical data you're capturing. And I'm sorry, I'm stepping all over your talk here, David. So go ahead.
You're doing great. Yeah, I think the slide speaks for itself. Absolutely, you want to take some time to do this process. Happy to cover any questions about this during the Q&A. Do you want to say anything else about this one?
I don't think so. I think it's all going to come down to somebody's protocol, and this certainly changes depending on the answers on how many data points, how many follow-ups with each patient, how many languages, how many sites you're collecting data from. It can change the quote entirely. In general, one of the things when companies are asking for some advice, I say, well, one approach could be as simple as every new user that is using your product, you might want to collect data from the first 10 patients. It's not statistically driven, but at the same time, that's going to give you, it's going to give you the early uses with each new user when you're going to expect to see the most use errors. And there's the greatest risk of, oh, we need to retrain this person right away because they're not doing it right. It's also the time when they're most likely to give you feedback. Once they've been using the product for a few years, they're an expert and they don't really even want to talk to you except to order more. And I think that whenever you're looking at new users and the first new cases that they have where they're trying to decide which patients are the best selections for the use of your product, that's the ideal time to be collecting data from a post-market perspective. So if you don't have a specific statistical plan that says this is how many users I need to go collect it from, these are how many patients I need to select it from, a very simple approach like that where it says the first X number of patients for each new user that we bring on board, that's our plan, is a very simple, straightforward plan with a very simple rationale, even though it's not statistically driven.
So your next steps are to send us your protocol. We'll send you our contact information with these slides and through the email as a preparation for the webinar. And we'll be happy to send you a quote for using Animan 7 for collecting your data and for Rob's services for writing your protocols and organizing your reports. And then, of course, we'll get your study started. And then, Rob, you want to talk about 4 and 5 here?
Yeah, I added on 4 and 5 this morning early, but one of them was that link to the ISO standard on post-market surveillance. That's brand new. You can see from the link, it's a pre-order. And then the second one is our post-market surveillance procedure. What's showing on the webpage right now is the old version of the procedure, and it doesn't give you a lot of details, but I'll be updating that page, and anybody that registered for this, I will send them out a little update that, hey, our procedure's been updated. But one of the things that people may not realize is that all our procedures, you buy it once and you get the updates free. So when people bought our risk management procedure 4 or 5 years ago, they're still getting updates even to the 2019 version that we created with no extra charges. So that's one of the things we offer to our clients is you buy a procedure and then we'll send you an updated one, and then you can do a merge and compare in Word to see what changes we made.
Excellent. It's time for the Q&A. Rob, do we have questions in the chat?
I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you can follow your the controls in Zoom, there's a little black bar that has the ability to click on chat, and so you can type in something. You can also unmute yourself and ask the question verbally, And then we also have some other questions that I think that we can go through as well. Maybe the question that we had about who should do your data analysis would be a good place to start. So when you're collecting all this data from a post-market clinical follow-up study, Andaman 7 helps you gather the data, but then what do you do with that data?
Right. So we work with other companies that are specifically biostatisticians, as you mentioned earlier, and we're happy to recommend those companies to you. We, as a company, are specifically focused on making it as easy as possible to collect the right data at the right time from the patient, and then we can pass that data to your statistician to do the analysis.
Okay. I'm going to go to our Q&A list here. So I'm going to minimize this screen and pull up our Q&A that we have, because a lot of people posted questions ahead of time. One of them was, can the app be linked with other known PROM databases? For example, Amplitude Clinical Outcomes, or does it have its own database sitting behind it?
Right. So Andaman 7 as a software platform does have a database that's where all the data is stored as the patient enters it, and then we do send it to your EDC, or if you just want a CSV file or however you would like the data, we can send the data to the sponsor or to the CRO in whatever format you like. And in terms of connection to other known PROM databases, I'm curious if the user is asking about specifically different survey instruments. And for that, we customize each interface every time the PROM questions come up. So the cancer PROM questions are going to be different than the diabetes PROM questions, which are going to be different than the suture PROM questions. So that's how we manage that from study to study. Hopefully that answers your question. If you need more clarity, I'm happy to answer it by email.
Okay, I'll go on to the next one. Can Andaman 7 be used for PREM research? PREM is an acronym meaning patient-reported experience measurement. And
yes, absolutely. It can be used for that. We can customize and configure the interface to collect any data that you like.
okay. Just making sure I don't have any chat questions here. The next one was PMCF template structure. It wasn't a full question, but they were asking, what is your PMCF template structure?
Right. So we work with Rob to understand the clinical endpoints that you're looking for. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, those are validated endpoints and surveys that the regulators already know. And if your product is different than what's already standard, we can work with you to understand the risk points and make sure that we collect the data that's relevant for that.
And when we say surveys, they might be things like questions asking somebody what their level of pain is. So a lot of times post-op in people that have had hip replacements, one of the questions that we have is, what is your pain level? And they give you a score that might be 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or 0 to 10. And they might even supplement that with some smiley and frown faces. But the idea is the person would click on the app with the selection of how they feel in terms of pain score, and that would be a very standardized method of gathering that information. But one of the problems we have when we're collecting paper forms is people not filling in all the questions or forgetting to fill in the surveys. So now you have a mobile app that's providing a notification to the patient, reminding them we need your feedback and at the appropriate time, so you don't have to go back to the doctor to give it. So it makes it much easier to collect some of that follow-up data that we usually miss and results in some of the patients being excluded from the study just because they didn't answer a question or didn't provide some data.
Yes, that's a very important point, that having it be digital has a lot of benefits, such as what you just mentioned, Rob. And also, we can obviously customize the interface, like you said, adding smileys, adding different ways to enter the data that it makes it easier for the patient. We're doing a project with Janssen right now that really uh, enhances our interface and makes it a lot easier for the patient to enter data. And of course, if there's any data that can be connected from a wearable, that's even easier to collect these days and less burden on the patient. So there are a lot of options today that didn't exist even 5 years ago for easing the burden on the patient data entry.
The next question I had here was, are there any database to find the clinical data and detail information of the equivalent device? This is one where you didn't have an answer written before. Um, if you want me to skip those, let me know. Sorry about that. I didn't ask earlier.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have any insight into that. Do you have some insight, Rob?
Yes, there are some clinical data. Oh, I see. There's a little note over here said I'm supposed to answer it. Now I'm catching on. So for clinical databases, one of the big things that they're trying to do with Unimed is to share clinical data through the PSURs, and um, initially it's being shared with competent authorities and notified bodies to make decisions on whether a product should be approved and should remain on the market. But it's also to make more of the data available about adverse events, such as it's basically the equivalent of what we have in the US with the MAUDE database and the TPLC database with the FDA. In addition to that, there are registries all over the world in all kinds of countries that can be accessed, and some of them are publicly available. There are some that you have to subscribe to, but there are a lot of publicly available databases. For orthopedic companies, one of the big databases we use is the Australian government every year has the survivorship data published for implants. And so you, in one place, in one country, you can get all the survivorship data for all orthopedic implants, which is huge for the orthopedic industry. It gives you some great data because it's only giving you data about the survivorship. Whereas in a post-market clinical follow-up study, you can ask other questions rather than just survivorship data. You can also ask about pain scores. You can ask about time to recovery. You can ask about mobility. These are all things that are really critical in the patient-reported outcomes that might not be anything that a surgeon can give you information about, because, yes, the person was in a lot of pain because they had hip replacement. They came back to me, they healed well, they had range of motion. That's all I can tell you. I can't tell you necessarily whether the person is still able to perform their job that they had before, or how high their pain level was, other than when they came into my office. And so you get much more detailed and useful information when you're doing the post-market clinical follow-up studies than you can get in most registries that are publicly available. So there's a very big difference between a registry created by a company with specific questions that they're asking patients to provide as patient-reported outcomes versus a registry that is a national registry that has only simple data like survivorship. I'm going to check back, see if we have any more. Oh, we do have a chat question. So the question is, what about e-diaries to be completed by a participant on several days? Does e-diary work the same way as an e-pro?
Yes, so Andaman 7 can collect today already up to 300 variables or endpoints for your study, and a diary type of data is one of them. And if there are others, we can easily add them. So yes, we have a diary built into the platform today.
Okay.
The next one for you, Rob, I can read off is,
Sure.
what is the primary post-market challenge facing us as a result of the changing regulatory landscape?
So the biggest challenge for companies, I believe, has nothing to do really with the difficulty of asking the questions or collecting the data or analyzing it. I believe the biggest challenge is companies don't know how to do it. So I look at it as being no different from a management review. If you've never done one before and you don't have a procedure for it and nobody trained you, you're not going to know how to do it. So I believe the biggest challenge is not that it's so hard to collect post-market data, it's that people don't know how to collect it correctly. They don't know what to ask, they don't know how to collect it, they don't know what the legal requirements are, and they all are trying to not spend money that they don't need to spend. So they can't believe that all of a sudden now I have to do all this extra work that's going to cost all this money, and they don't really know to which experts are giving them correct advice and which ones are not giving them correct advice. So that's one of the reasons why I point people towards guidance documents that were just recently created to tell you how to do this and give you examples. That's why we write procedures and we make them available on our website for free. In some cases, like manager review, where it would apply to just about every company, and then for small fees, like it's typically $2.99 for our procedures. That no, it's not free, but at the same time, it's also not thousands of dollars. So if a company buys these procedures, they know what to do. We also offer webinars like this one, teaching people how to do this. So I really think that the obstacle or that's challenging the entire industry is understanding what the requirements are and how to do it, not the actual task. There are many things that we do out there that cost tens of thousands of dollars that are technically more challenging than asking a patient how much it hurts and asking them at a certain frequency. Um, and if you write the protocol and give it to a company that is set up for this, like Annex 7, then you can collect your data. And each new user of the product or each new patient can have their email entered and can opt in or opt out. Um, so it makes it much easier to recruit willing volunteers than um, the way we used to do things to gather data, which was we would hire an outside marketing firm to go out and recruit people by radio and things like that.
Great. Thank you, Rob. We're here absolutely to answer any of your questions about the challenges and how to do it and to make it easy for all of you on the call. So thank you for being here today, and we look forward to answering those questions for you. So next question, go ahead, Rob, you can read the next one off there.
What would you say are the most effective methods for analyzing and interpreting the data collected as part of PMCF? And I think this is one that you had actually, I had written a short response and we already kind of answered, but it's the statistical data
Yes.
plan should be included in your PMCF protocol. So that should be a section of your PMCF protocol. It should be the statistical analysis plan. And that should be written by a qualified biostatistician. I have met a CEO that also was a professor that was fully qualified to do all the biostatistical plan and the analysis himself and corrected some mistakes made by others. But that's one. I can point out 100 others that couldn't tell you how to calculate a mean unless they had Excel or a calculator with a mean button or something. It's not something that everybody knows how to do. So if you don't know how to do it, this is something that you really should hire an outside expert to do. And most CROs will have biostatisticians that they use, but most CROs are using independent biostatisticians that are on an hourly basis. You can find them at universities, you can find them at research centers, you can find them in CROs. And I can even give companies a referral for one. And you are also using ones as well at your company, correct?
We have referrals. We don't have
Okay.
internal statisticians, no.
Okay.
We
So
can definitely connect you to some.
I don't know anybody except maybe a few CROs that actually have biostatisticians on retainer or full-time employees. So there are lots of people that use independent experts, but it's only something you need for a very short period of time and when you're doing the data analysis, and then you don't need them until the next project.
Excellent. So I'm looking at the clock here, and I can run through quickly a few of these other answers here, unless you have any other questions in the chat.
I don't have any more questions in the chat right now.
Okay.
I think we'll have more this afternoon when we have our other session in the U.S.
Right.
Because they have more registrants that are U.S. based, and that was the first time that we offered it initially.
Okay.
But yeah, let's go through a couple more questions. And I have time. I just don't know how much time you have.
Sure, I'm available. So the next question is, can the Animan 7 be white labeled? And the answer is yes. You can definitely have your logo at the top and when the app launches, or however you would like that to look. And then we covered, the next question was about languages, and we discussed that previously. Yes, it's available in 22 languages. New languages can be added. And the next question is about uh, patient retention and clinical trials. As I mentioned briefly, we feel strongly that, and we have this experience as well, when we're connecting to a hospital and the patient uses our app, they tend to keep the app installed on their phone over a longer period of time, again, because their health record in and of itself is adding value to the patient. And so that's on the retention side. On the engagement side, as I mentioned, we do have notifications and emails, and we can also, any content that you want to deliver to them, whether it's documents such as a PDF telling them about their disease or about their care path, or videos, or anything that you want to generate for engaging the patient, we can deliver through our interface, and to keep them engaged and up to date on the progress of their treatment and next steps potentially with the doctor. So we're happy to do that with our interface.
Um,
Go
I
ahead, Rob.
On this particular point, I think the biggest challenge in collecting data is getting the patient to come back to the doctor when you're doing it the old-fashioned way, where everything's a paper case report form, or
Mm-hmm.
even electronic data capture forms that are filled in by a nurse at the doctor's office,
Mm-hmm.
or the hospital. Those are old-fashioned methods that they're limited 100% by getting the patient to come back. And that's probably the biggest challenge for a physician or any kind of clinical study is, why would a healthy patient come back? If they're cured and it worked, why would I go back? I'm healthy. That's why I went to the doctor in the first place. So I wouldn't need to go back to the doctor. And so you get initial data when they're in the beginning stages and they're not cured or feeling better yet. But once the treatment has worked, they're they're harder to get to come back, and so you don't get those final endpoints that are critical to your analysis of your data. And so the most critical data we usually lose, and that ends up with a fairly high fallout rate in your studies. And the any regulator is not likely to accept data that has a very high fallout rate of your primary endpoint. So if you can't get that last endpoint of, you know, what's the healing rate of this particular procedure after 6 months, they made their 1 month and 2 month and 3 month visit, but they skipped 4, 5, and 6, and you had 70% of the patients skipped out on those last 3 visits, it might mean the product works exceptionally well, better than expected, but nobody wants to come back because they're healed earlier than expected. And so that's a real problem. Whereas this method of collecting data is not necessarily, it's not technically increasing the patient retention. The patients are still treated in both cases, but it's the inclusion or retention of the patient in the study that you have to, they drop out of the study if they don't show up, and you can't include their data, or you have to report that they were incomplete data sets. And incomplete data sets usually are suspicious to a regulator.
Thank you, Rob. The next question is, how do you validate the methods of collecting data, diary, ePro, eSource? So Animan 7 goes through many compliance checks, 21 CFR Part 11, and also the particular interface is typically reviewed by the IRB to validate the interface for collecting the data. So those are a couple of answers. I can go more deeply into the technical pieces of things. Fundamentally, we connect via APIs to your data lake when you want the data to be, wherever you want the data to be received, and we're happy to do a project with you to validate that the data is collected and exchanged. The next question is about costs, which we covered pretty well, and then clinical data. how do we collect clinical data? It's also via APIs to the EMRs, at least in the United States, we have the capability of doing that. And then what happens is the patient logs into their hospital, just like they would if they were logging into their patient portal, and our APIs bring the data from the hospital EMR into Annex 7. And then, as I showed, the patient can share their data with whomever they choose from that point, whether it's the sponsor or a new doctor or their mom. So that's the part of the amazing value proposition of the platform for exchanging data within Annex 7.
The next question there was one that was left for me. Best way to fill the gap on legacy with a legacy device on the market for more than 25 years. So you can imagine the problem that companies that are making low risk devices that have not required clinical data in the past and have justified why they don't need it, suddenly are facing with, now I need a whole entire section of my technical file for CE marking that has this clinical data that I don't have. And good luck finding somebody that wants to do a clinical study of any kind, whether it's post-market or pre-market, on a product that is low risk, particularly if it's a Me Too version of the product. So if I'm making yet another suture that's identical to somebody else's suture, why do I want to do a clinical study on that? I'm not going to learn anything new. I'm just going to verify that it's the same. At least that's my goal. So these post-market clinical follow-up studies are sometimes the only way to gather data on a legacy device. And so when this requirement came out and the MDR was released, everybody that was an expert in CE marking was telling their clients, hey, you're CE marked, but you don't have the kind of data that's going to be needed into the MDR. You need to start writing your post-market clinical follow-up studies now and collecting the data now before your CE certificate expires. And the clients that didn't listen to us and said, well, I'll do that later, they're going to give us extensions. Those companies are now facing, they may have to pull their products off the market. And I'm finding many companies are pulling their products off the European market because they didn't collect the data, or it's just too expensive for them to gather it now. If they had started earlier and they knew how to collect it in an efficient way, like this mobile app from Annex 7, then they would be in a great position now because they would already have the data that they need from both their European customers that have been on the market for 25 years, as well as their clients or customers in other countries as well. So this PMCF data collection is the method for gathering information on a legacy device. There isn't a source where you can just go look it up. You have to gather it for your device, and the burden for equivalence is very, very tough.
And what's great, because we do have the EMR integration, that if there's any data about your device in the EMR that's legacy, we can extract that for you through the patient and get that for you. So it can be retrospective data that you're collecting if that's helpful for your use case.
That's a great point. So those physicians that you know have been longtime steady customers, those would be great candidates for getting permission from their patients to share legacy data retrospectively. We have this next question was for David. Has any PMCF been using Annex 7? And is Annex 7 applicable to registrational or pivotal clinical trials? 2 questions there.
Yes, we've been doing a post-market study with EORTC, as I mentioned during the webinar earlier. That's in cancer, quality of life study. We've been doing that for a few years with over 40 hospitals in 10 countries in Europe. And yes, you can also use it for registrational clinical trials.
So it's not just post-market, it's for pre-market clinical studies as well.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is Annex 7 aimed to doctors or patients with mostly long-term outcomes? And how do you motivate doctors or patients to use the app?
Right. Annex 7 is definitely aimed at patients, and the doctors are motivated to do the research, sometimes in the US at least, to enhance their MIP scores. If you're not familiar with that, that's kind of the quality measurement system that doctors in the US are subject to so they can be paid. So that's one motivation for the doctors. Another motivation for the doctors or the hospitals in the US to be connected to our system is that there's another regulation under CMS, Center for Medicaid Services, that they must have their EMR connected to an app like ours. So, and then another use case for the doctors is customer loyalty to make it easier for them to interact with their patients over a long time, and engage with their patients and keep the patients as their patients. So there's a couple of use cases for the doctors, and for the patient, uh, it's just much less stressful than managing your paper records. So that's our value proposition for the patient and why they like to keep and use Annex 7 over the long term.
I think in particular the CMS requirement in the US, where they're worried about boomerang patients that go back to the hospital if they have bad outcomes. If you have anybody that has post-op instructions, they're sometimes lucid for those discussions with their physician and sometimes not.
Right.
And it may be no fault of their own or the physicians, but the current environment for healthcare is we shove the patients home as quickly as possible, whether they're ready or not sometimes. And CMS is really looking at, are you sending patients home too soon, or patients that weren't healthy and they're just boomeranging back to the hospital because the preparation and the care wasn't adequate. So having this kind of a system that can identify when a patient might be not recovering as quickly as they should be. A lot of times I see companies or hospitals contacting the patient at home, but nobody's answering the phone. And it might be because they can't. So it would be really helpful to have something that is on their mobile device notifying them, hey, can you give us some feedback on how you're doing, how are you feeling today, or have you taken your meds, maybe reminders to take the meds. Those are important things that you can only do with this type of technology, or if somebody answers the phone. And the hospital doesn't always have the resource to pick up the phone and call every single person 5 times a day to see how they're doing. And sometimes that's what's needed. I'm going to go on to the next question here. This one is another one that you've got listed for me to try to answer. Do the regulations for mandatory reporting, as with pharmacovigilance, apply here? If a friend tells me about an issue with a medical device, am I obligated to report it? So, I'll handle the second part first. In general, the instant a company or anybody in the company becomes aware of something that may or may not be an adverse event or complaint, they should immediately contact their complaint handling unit or whoever's responsible for recording complaints in the company, so it can be recorded, number one, and so the decision can be made whether it requires investigation and reporting for vigilance or medical device reporting or mandatory reporting, depending on what the term is that they're using in the country where you're located and where the event occurred. So that's immediate. They have deadlines, like not more than 24 hours, not more than 48 hours, not more than 5 days, not more than 10, not more than 30. But the intent is immediate. Whenever you learn of these and determine it's reportable, report it. Don't wait until the last minute. And you have to determine the investigations. And they actually require you to note down what the awareness date is, and the expectation is it will include verbal. So I recently had a client that didn't realize, oh, that was just verbal, so I don't need to worry about that. No. Even the verbal ones need to be included in your complaint database, and those decisions need to be made and documented. And you have to actually trend how you're doing on your complaint responses. So are you closing complaints in a timely manner, but also are you making the decisions in a timely manner? In investigations, are they being completed in timely manners? So that's the second part. The first part, do the regulation for mandatory reporting apply here? And so there is mandatory reporting in the US for class 3 devices. And certain class 2 devices, there are some cases where the FDA has said we want mandatory reporting. I think one of those examples was duodenoscopes that we were looking at. We actually came up with 2 different databases where one was devices that were under one code and one was PMAs. So there's 2 different databases that the FDA has of mandatory reporting, but that isn't all devices. So it depends on the specific device. And in the US, it's risk-based. So class 1 and class 2s in general are not required to do mandatory reporting. And I've even had de novo submissions that I've done with the FDA, and I said this would be a perfect example of when you should be using post-market data collection to address that issue. And the FDA said, well, we don't do that for class 2 devices. And that's not actually the case, but there are some examples, but it's not typically done. It's done as in only certain cases where there's a more larger concern of the safety of the device that's already been in the market for a while. So pre-market approval of or in this case, pre-market de novo classification approval, that's not what they typically do. Europe, it's different. They expect you to do this post-market reporting, and that's what the new PSUR is for. So they're basically implementing something very similar to the pharmacovigilance, but they're calling it a PSUR, and that will be what you update, and it will be visible to patients and available for patients as well, especially for all the high-risk devices. So that will that I guess the short answer is yes, it's applicable here. A question for David: how is patient confidentiality conserved when PMS is conducted?
Right, we definitely anonymize the data before sending it on to the third party for analysis or to you, the sponsor. So any patient identifiable information is removed from the data before we send it on. That's built into the system.
Okay. Next question for you. How can you ensure the effectiveness of long-term data collection with this app, in parentheses, data persistence versus unsubscriptions?
Right, and we discussed this a little bit earlier. It's a similar answer, which is that, again, we're creating value for the patients by enabling them to access and control their health records, which is being promoted, of course, by all the federal governments in Europe and in the United States. And patients are, in fact, taking more and more control over their records, and privacy is becoming more and more important and talked about every day. And so we're providing value for the patients. So that's how we plan to continue to stay in their hands and to limit the number of unsubscriptions. In terms of data persistence for your study, it's aligned with what I just mentioned, and also the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to do notifications and emails. If they've uninstalled the app, we still have the ability to email them. And if it's necessary for your study, we can add phone calls, as Rob mentioned earlier, to the process to make sure we get the data that you need for your product.
Okay. This next question is sort of like throwing a grenade into a room. It is, what is needed for a class 1 sudden example?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to pick Band-Aids for my example here. Class 1 sterile product requires notified body involvement, and everybody knows what a Band-Aid is. And we all know that Johnson & Johnson has the trade name on Band-Aid, and everybody else is a sterile bandage. But what do they need to do? So as a class 1 device, you're not required to do a clinical investigation. And so pre-market clinical studies are not required. A clinical investigation is not required. However, you still have the requirement for a clinical evaluation report, which is not the same as a clinical investigation. And you still have to provide that post-market surveillance section in Annex III for the new MDR. And you still have to either provide post-market clinical follow-up or a justification for not. And So a company like J&J that's had their product on the market for decades and decades and decades, and it's a very safe product that's been around a really long time, and so many other products have copied it. If I don't have everything up to the standard that they're looking for, what do I need to do? So I am sure there are some studies out there for Band-Aids. I haven't personally done the search for Band-Aids, but I am sure there are sterile bandage clinical studies out there. And I'm sure it would be possible to do the equivalence study or equivalence comparison between other CE marked sterile bandages and J&J's Band-Aids. There are going to be differences. And so under the really tight conservative perspective that some of the notified bodies are adopting, it might be hard to convince them they're equivalent, but they are equivalent. But at the same time, you may not have the data. And so even though your product's out there for 40 years, you might be required to still do a post-market clinical follow-up study, depending on what your notified body is saying. You also, your company is going to have to come up with justifications for why you don't need some of these things. Um, and one of the best arguments is how long your product has been on the market and what the complaint rates have been and what the adverse events rates have been. So if you look at a product like Band-Aids, they've been on the market for decades and their actual duration of usage in a patient is days. So that's a really great ratio to have decades of history and days of use. Whereas when you're talking about implants, you have decades of use in the body and maybe less than a decade of experience with a new company's implant. And so therefore, you're not going to have a good ratio. You're going to actually have longer use in the body than you actually have clinical data for, even post-market data. In those cases, you're going to be forced into doing post-market data collection because you might have a hip implant that lasts 20 years and only 5 years of data, even if you did a pre-market study. Class 1 devices usually are shorter usage and not implants. They're not going to be an implant. And so it really come down to how long has your product been on the market and what kind of data do you have already. But just saying your product's been on the market for 40 years is not enough by itself. You're going to have to do much more than that to convince people that you don't need to provide all this other stuff. And so that is a challenge. So I gave you one example, but each class 1 device out there is going to be different, and it's all going to come down to what data do you have, which is why I've been encouraging every company for the last 4 or 5 years to start collecting PMCF data now, so you're in a good position when your CE certificate expires in the next 4 years. And some companies, it's expiring this year, and if it's after May 26th, they're in deep trouble because they're going to have it renewed under the new MDR, and they may not be prepared. We've got about 10 minutes left here and a few more questions. The next question for David. Who will get and submit the patient's information?
Right, so the patient will be entering the data, and then as we showed in the diagram, you can have us route it to whoever you'd like to be routed to, whether it's to your EDC, electronic data capture platform, or simply a CSV file transferred to you securely via HTTPS, or of course shared with the physician in an anonymized way, non-anonymized way, as we showed in that diagram. So happy to discuss with you where you would like the data to go, what format. One of the unique things about Animan 7 is that it can interoperate with both the EMR and the EDC systems and manage the SNOMED and link codes and the FHIR and HL7 and the CDISC and all the different disparate type of protocols and standards for health information. So we're happy to route the information to where it needs to be routed using our platform. And so just give us a call and we'll be happy to look at that for you.
I think that answers the question that was the next one about how is data extracted and which format.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm correct that the software does not do the analysis. That would be done separately by an outside party that you introduce them to or the company has themselves, correct?
Correct. We work with third parties to do the analysis, yes.
The last question that I have on the list here is viewing social media expected to be part of the data you review?
So on our side, we don't collect that type of data. I don't know from your side, Rob, have you heard that the regulatory bodies are looking for that?
I know that social media is one of the areas that you could become aware of a complaint or an adverse event. So if you become aware of it, that would be something you would have to document and report. But it's not something that would be expected to be a pathway for gathering this type of data. It is the kind of place that you would get customer satisfaction data from, and that's one of the key ways we would differentiate the post-market clinical data versus customer satisfaction and customer service feedback. They're different sources, they're different types of data. We like the product, we recommend it to our friends. We don't like this, we think they ought to do this. I use it for this indication, blah, blah, blah. Those are all the kinds of things you might hear on social media, but those aren't what we would expect to be collecting in a study. So it's one of the ways that a lot of companies are making the mistake of confusing the two.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, it's not that social media isn't useful. It's just, it's different from clinical data. Nobody puts their clinical data on social media site or shouldn't.
Right.
I think that's the end of our questions for today, and I don't see any more items in the chat box. You have our contact information. Everybody will be provided a link to download the recording. I still see the recording button going, so we shouldn't have any problems obtaining that. So I think that's it for today. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you very much, David, for your time. I really appreciate it. And you really did a lot of prep for this. And I liked how you were able to demonstrate the app and show it with people right from your screen. So I definitely think our clients will be very happy to use it.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. We appreciate it as well.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.